Okay, everybody, hello. Thanks for joining us again today at 4 p.m. to the 5G Into the Abyss reading series, in which I open the virtual window of my virtual balcony or virtual fire escape, step outside and start reading pieces of literature that I feel like are written at times and by those who are in dialogue or in visual or metaphysical contact with the abyss, that very real and metaphysical state of awareness that we are just on a rock catapulting through space. But that's okay. Not make meaning along the way and not hold anything too dear. So today I continue with this dense yet I feel applicable piece of text from Czeslaw Milosz, or Czeslaw Milosz, the Polish poet and Nobel Prize winning writer for literature. He is a political theorist, poet, and just a well thought out individual from Poland, and then worked at UC Berkeley for a while. This is written in response to the transitions after World War II into communism and just the idea of the totalitarian state and how people adapted to it, in his book entitled The Captive Mind. So I'm picking up in the second chapter called Looking to the West, in The Captive Mind by Czeslaw Milosz, and the translator is Jane Zionko, from the Polish into English. It's a vintage international book, and here we go. The multicolored setting of Western life is subject to the law of osmosis. The average citizen of the West has no idea that a painter in a garret, a little-known musician, or a writer of unintelligible verse is a magician who shapes all those things in life which he prizes. Government officials give little thought to such matters, for they consider them a waste of time. Since it is not a planned economy, the Western state cannot come to the aid of people working in the various arts. They go on, each pursuing his own chimera, sometimes dying of hunger, while nearby, wealthy men, not knowing what to do with their money, spend it on the latest whims of their benighted souls. This order of things revolts a person from the East. In his country, anyone who displays any talent is used. In the West, the same man would have very little chance of success. Western economy squanders talent to an incredible degree, and the few who do succeed owe their success as often to pure luck as to native ability. In the countries of the new faith, the counterpart to this waste lies in the fact that the capacity to follow the political line is a selective criterion by which the most mediocre often attain the greatest renown. Nevertheless, the artist or scholar in the East earns his living more easily than his colleague in the West. Even though the pressure of the method is burdensome, its material compensations are not to be scorned. Many musicians, painters, and writers who had the opportunity to flee to the West did not do so because they felt it was better to compose, paint, or write somehow or other, rather than to teach or work in a factory with no time or energy left in which to perfect their true craft. Many of those who were abroad returned to their own countries chiefly for this reason. Fear of the indifference with which the economic system of the West treats its artists and scholars is widespread among Eastern intellectuals. They say it is better to deal with an intelligent devil than with a good-natured idiot. An intelligent devil understands their mutual interests and let them live by a pen, a chisel, or a brush, caring for his client and making his demands. A good-hearted idiot does not understand these interests, gives nothing and asks nothing, which in practice amounts to polite cruelty. To the people of the East, it is axiomatic that the basic means of production should belong to the state, that they should be regulated according to a planned economy, and that their proceeds should be used for hygienic, cultural, scientific, and artistic ends. It is naive to seek partisans of capitalism in their midst. The something these people look for in the West is certainly not warmed over watchwords of the French Revolution or the American War of Independence. They laugh at the argument that factories and mines should belong to private individuals. Their search for something springs from a more or less clear understanding of the fact that the new faith is incapable of satisfying the spiritual needs of mankind, for its efforts in that direction have, with inexorable regularity, turned into caricature. If they were forced to formulate what they seek, they would undoubtedly reply that they want a system with a socialist economy, but one in which man need not struggle desperately in the snake-like embrace of the method. So they seek some sign indicating that real cultural values can arise outside the scope of the method, but they must be lasting values, geared to the future, and therefore not products of obsolete concepts. Anything less would serve merely to confirm the method. The people in the countries of the new faith know that only in the West can there appear works that will bear the seeds of hope for the future. Perhaps discoveries no less important than those of Marx or Darwin have already been perfected in the workrooms of isolated philosophers. But how does one find them? The Eastern intellectual is a severe critic of everything that penetrates to him from the West. He has been deceived so often that he does not want cheap consolation, which will eventually prove all the more depressing. The war left him suspicious and highly skilled in unmasking sham and pretense. He has rejected a great many books that he liked before the war, as well as a great many trends in painting or music, because they have not stood the test of experience. The work of human thought should withstand the test of brutal, naked reality. If it cannot, it is worthless. Probably only those things are worthwhile which can preserve their validity in the eyes of a man threatened with instant death. A man is lying under machine gun fire on a street in an embattled city. He looks at the pavement and sees a very amusing sight. The cobblestones are standing up upright like the quills of a porcupine. The bullets hitting against their edges displace and tilt them. Such moments in the consciousness of a man judge all poets and philosophers. Let us suppose, too, that a certain poet was the hero of the literary cafes, and wherever he went, he was regarded with curiosity and awe. Yet his poems, recalled in such a moment, suddenly seem diseased and highbrow. The vision of the cobblestones is unquestionably real, and poetry based on an equally naked experience could survive triumphantly that judgment day of man's illusions. In the intellectuals who lived through the atrocities of war in Eastern Europe, there took place what one might call the elimination of emotional luxuries. Psychoanalytic novels incite them to laughter. They consider the literature of erotic complications still popular in the West as trash. Imitation abstract painting bores them. They are hungry, but they want bread, not hors d'oeuvres. Dialectical materialism awakens a response in them because it is earthy. They would willingly espouse a literature and art born outside the sphere of the method, but on condition that it be earthy, strong, and healthy, if only they could find it. It is significant that everything in the West that is strong enough for their taste turns on questions of social structure and mass belief. Such books are frequently Stalinist, but even more often anti-Stalinist. A great many of them have read Kessler's Darkness at Noon. A few have become acquainted with Orwell's 1984. Because it is both difficult to obtain and dangerous to possess, it is known only to certain members of the inner party. Orwell fascinates them through his insight into details they know well, and through his use of Swiftian satire. Such a form of writing is forbidden by the new faith because allegory, by nature, manifold in meaning, would trespass beyond the prescriptions of socialist realism and the demands of the censor. Even those who know Orwell only by hearsay are amazed that a writer who never lived in Russia should have so keen a perception into its life. The fact that there are writers in the West who understand the functioning of the unusually constructed machine of which they themselves are a part astounds them and argues against the stupidity of the West. Usually, what is strong in the West is purely negative. Its criticism of the new faith is often accurate, but despite this, it points no way out and introduces nothing to replace the method. One can, it is true, say that it introduces a living man unashamed of his thoughts and capable of moving without the stilts supplied by citations from the authorities. To the Eastern intellectual, this is insufficient. One does not defeat a Messiah with common sense arguments. The Christian religion, which is restricted or even exterminated in the countries of the new faith, always evokes a considerable, albeit unhealthy, amount of interest. Do Western Christians take the necessary advantage of their freedom? One is forced to the conclusion that they do not. Religion has become something in the nature of a vestigial custom, instances of which one finds in the folklore of various nations. Perhaps some pressure is needed if Christianity is to be reborn. The religious fervor of the Christians in the people's democracies would seem to indicate as much. One merely wonders if theirs isn't the piety of a mouse caught in a trap, and if it hasn't come just a bit too late. The official order is to evince the greatest horror of the West. Everything is evil there. Trains are late, stores are empty, no one has money, people are poorly dressed, the highly praised technology is worthless. If you hear the name of a Western writer, painter, or composer, you must scoff sarcastically, for to fight against cosmopolitanism is one of the basic duties of a citizen. Cosmopolitanism is defined as admiration for the bourgeois culture of the West. The term was invented in Moscow and is not new in the history of Russia. Over 100 years ago, Tsarist historians spoke with a version of the decadent West. It was in the decadent West of that time that Marx and Engels were writing. And it is from that West that it later proved necessary to import not only their work, but many other discoveries as well. In practice, the fight against cosmopolitanism in the people's democracies takes the form of elaborate prescriptions indicating which Western writers of the past, those progressive for their day, can be translated, what Western painting and music, usually created before 1870, is healthy, etc. No matter how much trouble these detailed orders create for editors, publishers, and music directors, the fight against cosmopolitanism is not entirely without rational justification. Its motive in the center is clear. Too broad a scale of comparison is incompatible with the moral health of the citizens. In the people's democracies, which have been subjected to Western influence for centuries, it is a question of liquidating bad habits. You break a smoker of his habit by taking away his cigarettes. In convincing himself that the center is not completely wrong to combat cosmopolitanism, the intellectual argues thus: the religion of Rome spread more or less over the area in which so-called European civilization arose. Those countries which today form the western provinces of the Imperium were for centuries the eastern peripheries of that civilization. The growth of modern Europe, with its concurrent development of trade and industry, deepened the rift between Europe and its outlying eastern marches. A citizen of Iowa, asked to define what he means by Europe, would probably name France, Holland, Italy, Germany. He would go no farther east, and he would imagine the inhabitants of that distant area to be a mixture of untrustworthy, backward tribes. It is possible that our Iowan is an example of historical lag, that his ideas are the products of concepts which no longer coincide with facts. Nevertheless, his opinions are characteristic and in fact reflected in American political moves, which did not see Russia's occupation of the eastern marches as a loss that could have had serious consequences. After all, it was in Western Europe that money and power accumulated through the centuries and that culture patterns arose, which later spread to the East. For example, Polish churches and palaces were built by Italian architects. Polish popular art was shaped by Baroque. Polish poets admiringly followed the forms of French verse, etc. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe were traditionally poor relations, a semi-colonial terrain. The West's attitude toward them was in general patronizing, and still does not differ much from the somewhat oversimplified opinions of the citizen of Iowa. The Pole, Czech, or Hungarian of average education knows a good bit about France, Belgium, or Holland. The Frenchman, Belgian, or Hollander of average education knows little about Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Hungary. The Eastern individual finds the state of affairs unreasonable and feels a certain solidarity with the Russian who has old and unpleasant scores to settle with the West. Even though he is irritated by Russia's inferiority complex, which leads her to demand constant homage and assurances of her unquestionable superiority, the West's disdain of Central and Eastern Europe upsets him even more, for it seems to spring from a lack of recognition of the change in proportion which has occurred in the 20th century. These countries have a large population which has displayed a definite ability to adapt itself to the exigencies of modern technology. They are rich in natural resources, and their mining and heavy industries are rapidly developing. Their worker no longer resembles the helpless emigrant who, setting out for the West in search of bread, was forced to accept the lowest type of manual labor. Their technicians and scholars can compete successfully with their Western colleagues. Their writers and musicians cannot complain of any lack of talent. And what is more, from every point of view, these countries seem to be the most important part, not only of Europe, but of the whole world. If we assume that the new faith will spread throughout the earth, then these are the first and therefore most interesting areas of the experiment outside Russia itself. If we assume that the center will lose, then the economic and cultural patterns that will arise subsequently in these countries will certainly be new, for there is no such thing in history as a return to the status quo. Then is one not justified in checking this idolatry of Western models, which was so prevalent among the cultivated circles of the Eastern marches? Why should present-day French painting, born in a country living on remembered glories, be imitated in Prague or Warsaw? Why should English plays written for a completely different public be played in Eastern capitals? One must break that habit of imitation, which was inevitable as long as French, English, or Belgian capital investing in the mines, railroads, and factories of the Eastern marches pushed its books, films, and styles upon them. Just as nationalized industry now stands on its own feet, so Eastern European cultures must learn to stand by their own strength. Unhappily, in freeing themselves from the spell of the West, the literature, science, and art of these marches became totally dependent on the new metropolis. Once imitation was spontaneous and voluntary, but now it is obligatory. Any attempt to find one's own way is denounced as Titoism. Any attempt to reach into one's own national past is possible only to the extent that the past parallels the development of the Russian nation. One may turn to folklore, obviously, and to the realistic plays of the 19th century, but, for example, Poland has a tradition of romantic drama which does not lend itself to realistic representation. It also possesses a tradition of stage production which is known as monumental theater. To continue such traditions would smack of dangerous heresy. The fight against cosmopolitanism is, in reality, nothing more than the act of emptying a retort and refilling it with a different fluid. In the past, a particular substance was created in this retort through the interaction of native and imported elements. Today, the imported element appears in much purer form, for a sufficient number of laboratory workers are eager to maintain the necessary respect for the formula. In the last century, the decadent West was condemned by patriotic Russian historians because it was liberal and because the ideas that emanated from it threatened autocratic governments. Nor was it only these defenders of the throne who criticized it mercilessly. One has but to read Tolstoy's What is Art to get a picture of the scorn for Western sophistication that is so typical of the Russians. Tolstoy regarded Shakespeare's plays as collections of bloody crimes, and French painting, this was the period of the flowering of Impressionism, as the daubs of degenerates. And the revolution, or after the revolution, when once again the social system of Russia differed from that of the West, it was not difficult to enlarge on this precedent with a goodly number of arguments. Didn't Russia's strength lie in its suspicion of the West? And weren't even Tsarist historians working for the revolution by cultivating Russia's self-assurance and faith in the special calling of the nation? Conscious of their hitherto latent power, the Scythians, as the great Russian poet Bloch called his nation, at last began to march. Therefore, it would seem that the nations lying between the Baltic and the Mediterranean seas would do well to imitate this Russian self-assurance and free themselves from the bad habit of parroting the West. The intellectual understands, of course, that he himself is cosmopolitan, since he looks to the West for something. This does not mean, however, that he complains about the orders that have banished Parisian boulevard art or American detective stories from his country. A great many cultural phenomena which excite the elite in Western countries are distasteful to him. Asked whether T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party should be played in his native land, he would undoubtedly answer no, whereas he finds The Waste Land by the same author an interesting piece of poetry. The new acquisition that the people of Central and Eastern Europe will never want to relinquish is the feeling of responsibility for what the public gets from editors or producers. If, for example, one considers a play bad, one should not present it even though it might be a considerable financial success. Just imagine a Prague or Warsaw worker looking at The Cocktail Party. On the other hand, the ban on Stravinsky's Le Sacre de Printemps is obviously absurd. The cosmopolitanism of the intellectual I describe is very moderate. He makes distinctions between what is worthy of his respect in the West and what owes its success to cheap publicity appealing to the taste of a dubious elite. The superiority of Russian realist painting, Pierre Dziezinski, it's Polish. I did speak a little Polish, but that's a word I can't say right now. Pierre Dziezinski over French Impressionism has been proved in Moscow. Unfortunately, the eye is used in the appreciation of a painting, and the most learned discourse cannot transform an ugly canvas into a great work of art, which is obviously to be deplored. At every step, be it in the realm of aesthetics or ethics, one encounters the opposition that the strangeness of man raises against the wisest of theories. It is reasonable that a responsibly raised child should inform on his father if he observes his behavior to be contrary to the good of the social order on whose well-being the happiness of all mankind depends. And yet the disgust such behavior awakens in many people is just as inexplicable as the preference for Manet over Russian 19th century realists. The recklessness with which the Russians are carrying out their mental operations in the people's democracies is reaching dangerous proportions. Consistent reasoning, which orders one to bypass a fact when a concept comes into conflict with reality, must eventually lead to costly errors. Hitler's war on degenerate art sprang from the same seed as the new ethics of his party, which ordered the slaughter of inferior races. And in these very ideas lay the causes of his defeat. Knowing the center's demand that science and art conform to the method instead of searching for objective truth and beauty, the intellectual comes to the conclusion that it is not the wisdom of the West that will cause the downfall of the imperium, but rather the aberrations to which the method leads. Announcing Mendelian genetics to be wrong, the center used roughly three groups of arguments. One, it contradicts the dialectical interpretation of Darwin's theory of the natural selection of species because it stresses those elements of his theory which are the reflection of the social circumstances of Darwin's age, namely the pitiless struggle for existence in a capitalist society. In place of the struggle for existence within a given species, one must substitute cooperation within a given species. It does not yield satisfactory practical results in agriculture. Three, it can serve as the basis for racist theories, since an individual is better or worse according to his genes. All these arguments evidence the wish that reality were all one longs for it to be. Yet what will happen if Mendelian genetics prove to be consistent with scientific observation? No matter how loudly he applauds the speakers who annihilate Western genetics, the Eastern intellectual suspects he is the dupe of an enormous hoax similar to the hoaxes of German scholars who scientifically proved whatever was necessary to the Nazis at a particular moment. This constitutes one step in the direction of doubt about the dialectical method itself. Is it not based at times on an interpretation of signs in nature and in history which the interpreter carefully placed there himself? Dialectics is the logic of contradictions, applicable, according to the wise men, to those cases where formal logic is inadequate, namely to phenomena in motion, because human concepts as well as the phenomena observed by men are in motion. Contradictions contained in the concepts are but reflections or translations into the language of thought of those contradictions which are contained in the phenomena. Very well. Yet what about the example Plekhanov goes on to cite to prove the inadequacy of formal logic? Someone points to a young man whose beard is just beginning to grow and demands a reply to the question as to whether he does or does not have a beard. One cannot say he does not, for he has the beginnings of one. One cannot say he does, for it is not yet a beard. In a word, the beard is becoming. It is in motion. It is only a certain quantity of individual hairs which will one day become a quality called a beard. Hell, mutters our intellectual, these are nothing more than 17th century rabbinical exercises. The hairs growing on the chin of a young man are absolutely indifferent as to what name one will give to them. There is no transition here from quantity to quality, as the faithful so piously proclaim. The problem, beard or no beard, arises from the language we use, from our system of classification. What boundless vanity it is to ascribe to phenomena the contradictions in which we are entangled because of our clumsy concepts. But this is a very serious matter. The fate of the Imperium hangs on that unhappy chin. If all the historical analyses carried out according to the method operate on the same sort of trickery, that is, if it first introduces the concept and then takes their contradictions to be the contradictions of the material observed, then the new Imperium may at times trip itself in its own acrobatics. And yet the Eastern intellectual is terrorized by the method. How can one explain this? Without confessing to anyone, he admits to himself that falseness exists in the very core of the method. But this does not prevent him from ascribing to the method any success he may have in working with material by other techniques. The method exerts a magnetic influence on contemporary man because it alone emphasizes, as has never before been done, the fluidity and interdependence of phenomena. Since the people of the 20th century find themselves in social circumstances where even the dullest mind can see that naturalness is being replaced by fluidity and interdependence, thinking in categories of motion seem to be the surest means of seizing reality in the act. The method is mysterious, no one understands it completely, but that merely enhances its magic power. Its elasticity, as exploited by the Russians who do not possess the virtue of moderation, can result at times in the most painful edicts. Nevertheless, history shows us that a healthy, reasoning mind was rarely an effective guide through the labyrinth of human affairs. The method profits from the discoveries of Marx and Engels, from their moral indignation, and from the tactics of their successors who have denied the rightness of moral indignation. It is like a snake, which is undoubtedly a dialectical creature. "Daddy, does a snake have a tail?" asked the little boy. "Nothing but a tail," answered the father. This leads to unlimited possibilities, for the tail can begin at any point. Asking himself why he cannot escape from its embrace, even if he should want to, the intellectual replies that the measure of the method's accuracy lies in the strength of those who rule in its name. They know how to erect a building with mobile walls on the ground that is constantly shaken by earthquakes, while the West, lacking equally perfected blueprints, clings to a traditional architecture that threatens to crash. Certain walls of the dialectical structure are so monstrous that they make the inhabitants fear for the future of a building so constructed. Or when they compare it with the static architecture of the West, they believe at times that all humanity will have to move into more mobile apartments. The Eastern intellectual's attitude toward the West is therefore complicated and not reducible to formulas of sympathy or antipathy. It is somewhat like disappointed love. And as we know, such deception often leaves a sediment of sarcasm. It took such a calamity to enable the new system, entirely contrary to the predictions of Marx, to have been born in backward Russia, and for the revolution to have become an enterprise directed by the bureaucrats of the center and extended by military conquest. It took such a calamity to bring matters to the point where Europeans seeking to change the obsolete order of their countries must agree, also contrary to the predictions of Marx, to submit to a nation which has never known how to rule itself and which in all history has never known prosperity or freedom. What a terrible fate to have been born in such an era. This is what our intellectual thinks, even as he pronounces a speech about the supreme honor it is to live in the great Stalinist epoch. His function is, as he defiantly calls it, to inoculate others with the basic principles of enthusiasm. It does not seem entirely unlikely to him that the West may emerge triumphant in its dispute with the method. Still, the method, that is the revision of Marx according to Russian patterns, though it has many weaknesses, is a stronger weapon in the hands of the rulers than tanks or guns alone, and it works effectively. Experience has taught the Eastern intellectual to measure his moves carefully. He has seen too many who fell into the abyss of disfavor for a single thoughtless step, for a single impulsively written article. If the imperium falls, it may prove possible in the ensuing chaos to seek new means of survival and action. Until that happens, one must work devotedly for the triumph of the imperium, secretly nourishing the hope that the stupidity of the West is not so unbounded as one is led to suppose. If only the people in the West really understood the mechanism of the great Stalinist epoch, and if only they would act accordingly, everything would seem to indicate that they do not understand, but perhaps they will. That is the end of the chapter Looking to the West in The Captive Mind by Czeslaw Milosz. I am going to continue with one more chapter from this really insightful, relatively short piece of political and philosophical theory by Czeslaw Milosz tomorrow. And I'm very interested in your thoughts just as you reflect on its relevance and what's applicable to today, both in terms of the metaphysical staring at value and worth and human practice in the face of the abyss and the shifting grounds that are revealed to be the only consistent thing that we can believe in, and as well as the current political climate that we find ourselves facing. All right, thank you very much, and I will see you all tomorrow.